Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Miriam Nababi, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm with the Equity and Inclusion Office. For those who may benefit from additional description, I'm a West Asian woman with chin-length curly hair. I'm wearing a dark top, and I have a white background. For everyone's information, the session today will be recorded. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and give thanks to the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people and the Silk Okanagan people on whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands UBC is located on. I'm joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples. So much of the discussion surrounding the topic of today's session is about belonging and the politics of recognition in spaces of teaching and learning, which for many of us are deeply complicated in relationship to land which has been occupied and which many of us are uninvited guests. In this tension, there's opportunity to be a good guest, which for me begins with acknowledging that Indigenous peoples who have lived in reciprocal responsibility to the lands that we occupy for millennia, and it's because of their generosity that we're able to have conversations about the complexities of inclusion and belonging for the students that we serve at UBC. I will provide a brief overview of our program before turning it over to our presenters from the 6 funded projects to present. Our time will close with some final reflections from my colleague at the Equity and Inclusion Office, Greg Lockwood. The Equity and Inclusion Scholars Program is an initiative of the Equity and Inclusion Office and which aim to cultivate opportunities for building capacity for transformative teaching and learning through the integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion in teaching-related practice and scholarship. This broad objective of the program was actualized through providing funding and supports to those working in formal teaching and learning spaces to enhance, through various interventions, which we'll shortly hear about, inclusive teaching practices. As you can see, inclusive teaching involves deliberately cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably, have equal access to learning, and feel valued and supported in their learning. Unique to the Equity and Inclusion Scholars Program was that beyond providing funding for diverse teaching and learning interventions, the program sought to build a network of scholars across ranks and disciplines to expand conversations related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in teaching and learning. Additionally, the model was centered around a faculty learning community where scholars convene to share, learn, and discuss their projects. Lastly, projects were selected based on their potential for transferability to other disciplines and potential to be scaled up. 6 projects were funded, and all 24 researchers connected to the projects were part of the broad network that convened around the faculty learning community. Funding was provided for a 2-year period, and projects were extended for an additional year without additional funding to account for pandemic-related disruptions. As you will shortly hear, there was a diversity across not only the types of projects, but the cohort of scholars who held diversity across ranks, disciplines, outputs, and facets of equity and inclusion. I'd like to thank the project teams for their scholarship as part of the E&I Scholars Project, their willingness to engage in the experiment of the faculty learning community and work with us on evaluating the developmental model of the E&I Scholars Program. The 6 projects are listed here, and they will present in the order that they are listed. I'll just give a moment of pause for you to look at the titles and the individuals connected to those projects. And with that, I will turn it over to our first presenter, Neil, to start us off.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. Obviously, my title of the project was Community Building Through and in the Disciplines. It was originally sociology and anthropology, but with the pandemic and with the application of that, it's now sociology and the arts, and thinking how my experiences in sociology can be applied across more courses and more teaching environments within the arts. So for many of you, when I talk about community building, what I'm referring to here is community building education, which I'll get to in a second. In the first year of the project, I had a research assistant who unfortunately can't make it today. But in the last year, the work has been conducted primarily by myself. So community building education, what is this? Initially, prior to my kind of full-time position as a lecturer in sociology, I was working in student services and facilitated orientation events and training of orientation leaders for programs such as Jumpstart and Imagine Day. And in that role, I used to kind of facilitate from the Equity and Inclusion Office community building education to student leaders. And student leaders responded very positively to this. And I always wondered, why is it only student leaders that are actually attaining this education? So I had the idea to adapt and embed existing education resources from the Equity and Inclusion Office, community building education, within first year arts courses, and actually make it, instead of co-curricular, something within the curriculum and improve its inclusivity to a broader range of students. So that was the main kind of aim and rationale to start off with, and then B, evaluate and disseminate the impact of this on community building, student learning in first year arts courses. So in the first year, it was really kind of workshopping with teaching assistants and students. I took the existing 3-hour kind of workshop, which is often done with student leaders, and adapted it to kind of discussion group format kind of sessions. So instead of 1 3-hour session, I adapted to 3 times 50-minute sessions, and took and developed CBE instead of a 1-day event, but over 3 weeks, and then tried to integrate that with class content and concepts, and really try to intertwine and do community building education through the discipline of sociology. So these have become kind of Canvas modules, which are both suitable for either in-person or online delivery. And obviously there's assignments attached to these, which can be used either formatively or summatively. In the kind of, there was a bit of a pause for the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic and then post-pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic, but not post-pandemic, I've kind of delivered CBE in its current format, in person and online, to roughly 150 first year students within my sociology courses. Now, at the end of each course, I've been able to evaluate through a student survey that students complete, and the kind of strong kind of positive feedback in terms of 68% strongly agree that the education really helped build community in the course, make friends, get to know each other, and have an inclusive environment. Also that it kind of strongly kind of correlated with their learning of course material, and also really, which is really kind of significant, which is a significant part of CBE, is really unpacking and thinking through their understanding and significance of the land acknowledgement at UBC. And that really takes me to kind of the benefit of spending time and giving space to developing and evolving community building education into and through the curriculum and within the courses. So because I had more time and more space, I decided that instead of just kind of unpacking the kind of land acknowledgement within the classroom, that I would try to attempt to do for the first time a land acknowledgement walk, using CB and using the Belkin Art Gallery's Musqueam Housepost Tour by Jordan Wilson. And this really brought kind of the land acknowledgement and the history of UBC's kind of relationship with Musqueam more to the fore, and something that students were talking about outside of the classroom. It came out of the classroom and became more kind of place-based. And here are some couple of kind of quotes that I received from some students having done this walk at the end of the course and thinking through and reflecting back on doing the land acknowledgement walk. The biggest change was that prior to this class, I stopped paying attention to the land acknowledgement and didn't really understand its importance. Discussion and exploration in class completely changed my perspective. I felt I came to understand the Muslim community better through the CBE. I was able to reflect on the material representations of their culture on campus and what that meant to the UBC community. So that was one of the key highlights, and that also stimulated excellent conversation. And having that kind of openness at the beginning of the course also set a tone for the remainder of the course that everyone felt they could share and have their voice heard. By creating that space and by people unpacking their position and thinking through their frames of reference, which community building education is really kind of designated and designed to do, and giving that time, and then also discussing concepts in class through lectures that related to it and linking the two, really allowed me to go a lot further than what had ever been before when I used to facilitate CBE with student leaders in one-day workshops. And therefore I could really start to get deeper and get also to know my students a lot better. So one of the key highlights is that community building or education also was elevating historically marginalized voices. I have a lot of students within my courses that do come from traditionally or historically marginalized groups, and they were clearly that their voices were being present and heard by other students really set a tone and a strength for the class. And therefore, there's some reflections here from students that although UBC has done a lot to ensure that everyone feels included in the community, there's still much more to be done. So also thinking that it's a process, that's something that's not just there, but also something that needs to be worked on. And here's an example of someone who felt that they found themselves within the course. It was really nice to have ideas validated as a non-binary person. This obviously wouldn't happen for everyone and in every situation, but I was blessed with roommates who were considerate and kind in regards to the ideas I had or personal experiences I could share. And they brought good ideas to the table themselves about gender inclusivity on campus. So a lot of the ideas from CB developed and were also evolved into other aspects of the course. So while CB was one part of the course at the start of the course, it also evolved into and could be built on throughout the course into different assignments and different activities. So it lay a great foundation for building community to go deeper into other aspects that I was looking at in terms of social inequality, which is the course that I teach at the first year. So really just to sum up and surmise of the experiences of integrating or teaching CBE or doing CBE as a practice within sociology, there's really three implications. That it opens up space. I think what we've seen is a greater demand for students now to talk and think around their own positions in relationship to UBC and the others and themselves. So it really gives space for students to unpack and discuss their frames of reference, how they see the world. Sometimes we refer to as positionality safely. It's a safe space for them. And by placing CB at the start of the course and prioritizing it and making it front and center and giving sufficient time to it, it was over 3 weeks, centers inclusivity and enhances community and the learning of course material. And by integrating it with course material, it elevated the impact of CBE and their student learning. So CBE's impact is elevated when it meshes with course content and concepts through and in a discipline. And I will continue to do this, and I will continue to hopefully persuade others. My only concern, obviously, here is that I've designed it for my course, and would others want to do it in another course, then maybe there's an issue of duplication, is that students would do it. But I think giving space in any course to students to unpack and discuss their frames of reference at the start of the course really sets a tone for inclusive teaching. So finally, I'll just surmise to say that it is scalable, it is doable, it does not, the work and the resources are there if anyone would like to see them and maybe implement them in their own courses and thinking about doing this type of work. And I would only say that just that you actually dedicate the space, the time, and you think how you can translate it or interpret and use your own discipline to approach the content and the materials.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mario Brondani. I'm calling from our beautiful Point Grey campus here, land of the Musqueam folks. I'm very blessed to be working here for the past 20 years. I'm a Latino male with short hair, wearing glasses. I'm wearing like a dirt white sweater, and on my background is part of my office, which is a mess. So sorry about that. And I have here my friend and also presenter Leanne Donnelly, in case I mess up and I say something that I should not have said. So the title of our work is really bringing the community as a teacher. So a good segue from what Neil was just mentioning. And we are focusing on two issues in particular with this grant: how to talk with dental students and dental hygiene students about sexual diversity, but also substance use and addiction. So that's basically what we plan with the grant. We had a number of community members that were part of this development of this teaching courses, if you will, or sessions. And they are all involved from the planning part of the sessions to the evaluation part of the sessions. And we are really pleased because we do like to involve the community in all aspects of our teaching here. And within this idea, we brought the community to UBC campus where they could interact with the students and share their stories. And we end up actually developing 3 sessions, as I will explain in a little bit. And really, the reason that we did this was to teach cultural diversity within all the disciplines, including hygiene and dentistry. That is always a question, how diverse are we? But I think perhaps we don't talk much about diversity in the community and how they are represented by the patients. In this case, the healthcare providers see in their practice. So I like that idea as well. So what we did, we did develop a community collaborative teaching modules, if you will, or sessions to address mostly sexual diversity and substance use, but also we realize that we also have to talk about social responsibility. What does it mean to be a socially responsible provider, which is the 3rd session that we end up adding, which you can see on this next slide. So we did a number of community consultations before these sessions started. So as was mentioned at the beginning, we received this grant around April or May 2019, I believe. I might be off a little bit in terms of the dates here. And these sessions happened for us in January of the following term, January and April. So this was 2019. As we all know, 2020 came with a pandemic, but we managed, as you will see, to do a few things there. But during summer, we consulted with the community. We hired students, both undergrad and grad students, to take part of this and to develop these 3 sessions. They are each 2.5 hours long. One to address sexual diversity or queer health, as I pose there. Another to talk about substance use, and a 3rd one to talk about social responsibility. So we added 1 session that we haven't planned initially, which I think is great. We evaluate using multiple means: community feedback, focus group discussion, students' feedback through course evaluation and reflections throughout the 3 sessions. So in 2020 or 2019-20, which was the first year that we were introducing the session, if you remember, this course happens on a Wednesday. So if you remember in January 2020, I know it's been like 2-3 years ago, we had a snow day that Wednesday. So we could not deliver the session on that Wednesday. Little we knew that online learning would become a norm in the faculty or in the globe, really. But we ended up not delivering the session on that Wednesday. But we delivered the upcoming Wednesday session and then the social responsibility one. But then we managed, with the pandemic happening and online learning, we developed all 3 sessions 2020-21. And we also delivered the session this year. So we have been delivering this over the past 3 years at least, which I think is important for sustainability. Then, so that's what was there. So for us, as I said at the beginning, involving the community as the teacher in the classroom is quite important. Our students do go to certain communities to provide care, but what we did, we brought the community in the classroom in Point Grey here to actually share their stories and their experience with healthcare providers in their lives. So I think that's very empowering. We use a modified flipped classroom approach, meaning there is a little bit of pre-work done by the students. Then they come to class and we deliver or build on the content. The number of students here are about 55 to 60 dental students and between 20 and 24, 26 dental hygiene students. So we have both programs, but very few sessions they collaborate. And this was a great opportunity to have them both together within the same session, having small group discussions with both undergrads discussing the issues that we had for the day. In one session, for example, the substance use, we brought in the megaphone, the speakers bureau. If you go to downtown or the east side of Vancouver, you see those folks selling magazines such as this one that I'm just showing. I'm just showing a magazine of the megaphone folks. They are folks that experience homelessness, so it's quite empowering for the students to hear the stories from folks in the community. The session on gender diversity, we have usually a panel that I invite members of the community, including, I try to bring a lot of members of the alphabet LGBT plus. Some years we are more successful than others, but the experience is quite impactful for the students. This next slide is just a screenshot of one of the tools that we use. Is called Mentimeter. Is a website where you can ask students to provide questions or input. Is anonymous. So this is a screenshot of a session that we had on substance use. And the question there for them was, what do you like to learn from that session? So January 8th, the date says that on that particular year was a Monday, and the session runs on Wednesday. So by Wednesday, we try to see if we can address most or some of the questions that students pose the Monday before. Of course, we cannot address all of them, because you imagine you have 60 plus 20 plus students there, so 80 questions. Of course, not everybody contributes to the questions there, but it's quite a lot of questions, very important questions, and we try to address as many as we can. So that's what we do pre-session. And for us, it's important to have this kind of collaboration, not only with the community, but with the students themselves, because we think that making this teaching more inclusive, we believe that students that belong to certain minority communities, they might lower their anxiety of being on campus, for example, and feel less stress if they know that there are others like them that are around them. So I think that decreases anxiety and stress, as we heard from the students. And for me, in terms of making this like inclusive teaching, is if you put a face on, for example, on substance use, or if you put a face on homelessness, or if you put a face on somebody that experienced social injustice, is much more powerful than me as an instructor just telling the students that these things happen. So if we bring folks that are impacted, both positive but also and mostly negative, I think it's more transformative for students to learn. I have here a screenshot of just one of the many reflections that we got from one of the students. This one is on the session on substance use. This student mentioning how privileged they were, and they are, as dental and dental hygiene students, how that impacted their view on substance use. And this student is also reflecting on one of the testimonials that we had in class by a homeless fellow, giving his experience on the street, so it was quite empowering. We also did, and I think that's in terms of dissemination there, we wrote a manuscript. So on this slide on the bottom, you see a screenshot of the publication that we managed to publish through PLOS ONE journal. And on that publication authorship, you see all those names. They are both the students and the community members. So are both myself and Leanne there, but also students and community members from all those two communities, experience homelessness, and those with substance use, and also folks that talk about social responsibility. So for me, that's, as academic, that's a good cherry on the cake there to have a publication, but more importantly was to involve the community in classroom. So as I said, in summary, we had 3 sessions. These sessions continue even after the grant, and I'm quite happy to say that this session will remain in the curriculum now that we are introducing a new dental public health course that will incorporate these 3 sessions. So for me, that speaks volumes in terms of sustainability of this initiative. So thank you very much. We were able to hire students, as I said, but also community members as assistants for the sessions. We present the pedagogy of this session on the CBRC Summit that happens in Vancouver every year. We also present part of this in the 2020 Research Day that we had here in dentistry. And for me, the important thing in terms of academia also is the publication there. But of course, as an instructor, I have to always question, are we making an impact? So are we making a difference by bringing folks that experience certain diversities to the classroom? Are we changing students' views on those communities? And the answer is, I don't know. I hope we are, but because we didn't follow up with students after the graduation or how they are interact with those communities now, it's tough to say that we had made an impact. As an instructor, I hope we have made, and I believe we did, but I cannot quantify that impact. And another thing that happened, probably relate with the Equity Scholars Program, was we create our own diversity, equity, inclusion office, and that I happen to be one of the co-directors. So I'm quite happy with, again, another sustainability in terms of addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in our teaching here. So that was from me. Thank you very much. Our emails is on the screen, but we can share that with you. And now I would like to invite Janice to present her piece. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone. Sorry for the confusion. I believe I'm pinned in the Zoom view. However, I am a white female and I have blonde hair with black glasses and kind of a background from a hike at a spiritual place that I took back in March. And so we're really excited to present our project from the Faculty of Science. I'm joined today by Jackie Stewart from the Department of Chemistry and also the Faculty of Science Dean's Office, and Jackie will speak to in a bit, and also Christine Goodhart, who's our fabulous science education specialist and also in the biology program. So thank you for being here today and listening to us. Our project is called Enhancing Equity Across Active Learning Introductory Science Courses. And I'll just test out my slide. And here is our project team. So it's actually quite a large team. You can see that there's a number of undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty members, science education specialists. We were really fortunate to receive also Work Learn funding. So thank you to Work Learn for help supporting all these different students and their contribution to the project, which has been a wonderful interaction. And I think Jackie and I positively say that our weekly meetings are the highlight of our week. And so we, in addition to Faculty of Science and our Center for Teaching and Learning Technology, we really had great interest in the project and support. So overall, what is our project? In the Faculty of Science, there was really a need for science, technology, engineering, math educators to kind of understand what the student populations were with respect to their academic identities, even their social identities, and also how these EDI practices that we take from the literature that we know of, how they translate into inclusive practices in our own classrooms. And so we wanted to have a better understanding about how these tools and practices for these learning activities that we do in first year science classrooms, how do they translate into our classrooms, and how can we improve and better understand the diverse needs of our students? And just to give you context of our classrooms, we have most first year science classrooms are large lectures, you know, with 200 to 300 students. And so we may not have the kind of individualistic approaches and interactions that you can get with larger classrooms. And this was part of our lack of understanding a bit, maybe who are the types of students and in our classrooms in front of us. So overall, the project, our project included 3 types of constructs that we were looking at. So in particular, we were looking at learning activities because these science classrooms often use active learning approaches. And so we wanted to know, how do different students participate in their learning. We also wanted to explore self-efficacy and belonging in the class. So how do students feel as part of belonging in the discipline, belonging in the course. And lastly, how do students perceive our classrooms in general? So how does the classroom climate interact with the student and help support or help support students' identities? And so we were looking at the demographic inequities across all these three topics. So it's quite a diverse project in that way. So what did we do? So this is kind of what we started with. We had these psychological constructs that we had seen in the literature that applied to different STEM classrooms. And then we developed questionnaires from that, and we deployed those questionnaires and surveys to the students. And then we collected that data. So as we all have been in this since, the initial 2019 project, like pre-COVID and throughout COVID, we did deploy at different times surveys to the students, and we used two different approaches depending on the surveys. We had the factor analysis, which is more of a quantitative analysis or quant crit analysis. And then we also had open coded questions that we had coded. And then we asked students for demographic questions, and we looked at demographic inequities from that. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to pass you on to Jacqueline Stewart, and Jacqueline can highlight some of our accomplishments over the past 3 years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. So also to describe me, I am a white woman sitting in my office on campus, and that is relevant also to this work. So while I come from a science background where certainly women have faced sexism, I also come to this work with a great deal of privilege, and I've found that the last 3 years of being involved in this project have really transformed me. So thank you for that, both for what we've learned, and I think the path we're on in terms of our teaching and learning and research into how our students are experiencing our classes. And to kind of follow on from what Karen was sharing, we have developed or revised some instruments that we've done with our classes, and we're looking both at all of biology, chemistry, and physics, specifically first year. And our goal is to identify whether inequities exist by looking at that disaggregated data in a really careful, hopefully as thoughtful as possible way, and help decide on what kinds of interventions we can do to help make our courses be more equitable. So that's kind of the path we're on, and we're certainly not finished. We haven't solved all the problems that we've uncovered, but we're learning a lot and hoping to make an impact. So you can see from the list that we have developed 9 different and revised surveys, depending on what type of thing we're measuring. We have collected data in 5 different courses. We have worked in 40 different sections, and we have over 9,000 student responses, which is a pretty huge data set. And that's great. We have this team who can help us analyze all these data. And we're also collecting really detailed demographic data that we've tried to collect in a responsible way. And part of the reason why we need to collect this data ourselves is because as of right now, the institution does not have institutionally kind of collected and vetted student demographic data. We're hoping that changes in the future with the Student Demographic Data Project, which we think is really important because it's certainly not ideal to have to, collect this as part of a survey in our classes. We have worked with several team members, like Karen mentioned, and learned from them and also provided mentoring. So it's kind of a two-way street. And we have some traditional deliverables. We presented our work at several conferences. We have one publication, hopefully more coming out. And internally, we have discussed our results with our departments, which is, I think, a really important part of leading to change, right? We need to bring all of these results into the classroom where people who are teaching can actually make changes based on them. So that's a little bit of our highlights. Of course, the pandemic changed a lot for us. We are looking at, for example, classroom climate, and then the pandemic led to what's a classroom, really different. Sense of belonging. I think when we've separated people, looking at social belonging just became a big challenge and very different. And so certainly we've had to adjust our plans a little bit, and our research is done in this context, and it is very contextualized. What we're noticing is that our work is a bit different than some of the similar studies in the US, that we don't have a great baseline of students' incoming knowledge in these disciplines, which we would love to include in our quantitative analysis. And that's something that we hope to be able to develop and measure ourselves with some existing tools. But it certainly makes it challenging, because we want to say, however students come into our courses, whatever kind of background knowledge they have, we want them to maybe leave the course in a similar state as each other, so they could go on and have similar access to degree programs and careers and so on. Yeah, I'll say also the demographic data, having to collect it ourselves, means that we don't have a perfect response rate. Students might wonder why we're collecting it, maybe not be so trustworthy about their instructors not having access to that. And then there's a risk of stereotype threat. If people see those demographic questions, they might say, oh, are they asking me this because, you know, I'm not supposed to be in this class, for example, and we don't want that. I'll try to wrap up soon here. I know we're reaching the end of our 10 minutes soon. So what I'll say for the implications is certainly everybody involved in the team. I can say we've all learned a lot from how to do work in this equity space, right? Some of us came in with more experience than others. We have been really I guess, convinced by or moved by the idea that we're not trying to pinpoint student deficiencies and say, oh, you know, this group is weaker, we need to help them, but really try to look at the system and the structure of our educational system and see what kinds of changes we can make to help make you know, progression through our degree programs more equitable. And so I think that's great as a conversation starter. And then the tools we've developed, we think are really hopefully going to be useful to others to get to know their students better and to think about their own teaching practice in a more detailed way, beyond just grades, for example. What are the other things we can look at? And I am really excited to say that we've received some external funding to continue this project. So because one of our team members went to the University of Calgary, we started kind of working across campus. And we have this idea that really doing this work at one institution is great, but if we can combine our efforts across a greater number of institutions and contexts, that will be better. And so we're partnering with Calgary, University of Toronto, Scarborough, and York University to collect more data and also really link the research side to the classroom practice side and make sure that those two groups are coming together to implement more inclusive teaching practices and then assess the extent to which that does make our courses more equitable, which is what we're trying to do. So that's exciting. And you can follow up with Christine, who is here today, if you have any questions, because she can kind of funnel the questions to other people. And you might be wondering, you know, we didn't present any data directly, and that's just because of lack of time, but we're happy to chat with people if you really want to know what we found about some of our quantitative and qualitative analysis. We're happy to share that at another time. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shabano. I'm a South Asian, Pakistani, dark-haired female. I go by the pronouns of she and her. And I'll be co-presenting today with Talia Roos, who is the lead researcher for the study. I'm joining from my home in Mount Pleasant in Vancouver, which is on the lands of the Coast Salish people. I'm grateful to be here and happy to be learning from everyone here. So our study was focusing on increasing accessibility and equity, particularly in clinical education in health and human service educational programs. This is our project team. Our team members spanned both UBC campuses and across a number of health and human service education programs, all of which are focused on in our study. So just as a bit of background, prior research revealed that students that require accommodations in their educational programs face a number of barriers, and there tends to be a lack of clear procedures, policies, and processes for them to follow. Specifically with healthcare education, there tends to be a practical component, the fieldwork component of their education program. And we found that the barriers that students face, particularly in a fieldwork context, tend to be specific, and that tends to be a specific gap that fieldwork education tends to face. And so additionally, there's of course ongoing systemic ableism and biases that persist within institutions and healthcare organizations and beyond. And so students face these biases and these challenges within their educational journeys, and then onward once they make it to healthcare professions. And so keeping that in mind, our study had 2 phases. In phase 1 of our study, the research question that we were addressing is, what are the strengths and limitations of current practices? And so we had 3 participant groups. These are sort of core participants and sort of all of the key individuals involved in this process. The first being students that require accommodations in fieldwork contexts. Next is academic fieldwork coordinators. They are members of the program, often faculty members, who are responsible for matching students to certain fieldwork sites. And so they are integral to the process of fieldwork accommodations. And thirdly, we had preceptors or fieldwork educators. These are individuals that supervise students directly within fieldwork contexts. And so in order to understand how things work and what works well and what doesn't work well, what are the strengths and limitations, we had online surveys. We had 3 separate surveys for our 3 groups. And then we had follow-up interviews and focus groups just to get a deeper understanding about the issues that each of these individuals face. And so at the end of phase 1, we identified 6 key problems. The first being much of which is consistent with previous research. And so that we found that there tends to be a lack of clear process for seeking fieldwork accommodations. This is consistent across students, academic coordinators, and fieldwork educators. Additionally, we found that there tends to be a delay when it comes to requesting fieldwork accommodations. Additionally, often students are not even aware that fieldwork accommodations are available to them and that they are an option. And relatedly, key stakeholders that are part of this process are often not involved in the process of seeking and implementing fieldwork accommodations. And then again, consistent with prior research, there is a tremendous amount of stigma that holds students back and complicates the process, as well as there tends to be no formal evaluation of the accommodations themselves. And so that often leads to points towards a lack of accountability if no one is following up on any accommodations that might be implemented. And so in phase 2 of our study, which is ongoing, we aim to address those problems that were pointed out in the first phase. And so our aim was to develop best practices for the process of implementing fieldwork accommodations. And these were all informed by findings from phase 1. And so our proposed solution was so we created a flow chart, which is in essence recommended a procedure, given that there seemed to be a lack of clear procedures. We'll be looking at the flow chart shortly. So the flow chart has steps, detailed steps about what should be done, when should certain conversations and points of communication happen, who should be involved. Relatedly, we have checklists that accompany the flow charts. These checklists detail key points that should be discussed at each point of the fieldwork accommodation process. And finally, to see if indeed whether these recommended best practices are useful, we have an evaluation process to let us know whether in practice these best practices are as effective as we would like to, but whether or not they're effective.
My name is Tala, I go by she, her, and I'm a faculty at the OT department. I'm a white settler, and I'm zooming in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. So just following up on Shabano's introduction. So this is the flow chart, and obviously it's way too tiny for you to follow, but it's just the idea is to show you how we created a system or a method for everyone who is involved in the process to know exactly what needs to be done, when, and by whom. And next slide will show you a little bit more of a close-up. So, and the way the flowchart was created, and it was created in collaboration with the accessibility offices, both here at UBC and in UBCO. And Laura is here on the call, so thank you, Laura, for all your contribution. So we identified the problem, and then for each of those problems, we created a solution that is depicted in the flowchart. And the flowchart includes few steps. For each of the steps, there is an indication of who needs to be involved in that step, when this step should take place, and what needs to be done in this step. And as Shabano indicated, we've also created checklists that literally it's checks box for everyone to know exactly what needs to be covered in each of those steps. So we've tested this process with all health and human service programs at UBC. And just for those who might not be familiar, so health and human service programs might include medicine, nursing, OT, social work, teacher education, those programs that are including also a placement or a fieldwork education in the program. So we've tested those. We are currently analyzing the data. As everyone mentioned before, COVID sort of delayed a bit our project, and we just finished evaluating this second phase. So we're in the process of evaluating the results. But it's based on the conversation that we had with all stakeholders, with the faculty, with the students, with the accessibility advisors here at UBC. It looks like the flow chart and the process that it created increased the clarity and knowledge among all stakeholders. Therefore, it includes accessibility for students, and it also, most important, increased the sense of belonging for the students themselves who require accommodation. Similar to the project before us, we were also able to get external funding for a similar study, which is a national study. So we are now, and this funding was by SHIRK. So we are now running a similar study on a national level with collaborators for 10 professions across Canada, which probably is one of the biggest studies looking at students requiring accommodation in the health programs in Canada. So I'll be happy to respond to questions if there are any, if we have time at the end, and I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Thank you very much. So I'm Chris Lee. I'm Director of Asian Migration Studies. I'm East Asian male, calling in right now with a fairly funky Zoom background from East Vancouver, which is located on the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Let me just start by thanking actually the EIO Equity Scholars team, particularly Mariam Nababi, who I know has been really shepherding and holding us for these past 2-3 years, although it's probably felt like forever, and also to Greg and Hanai when Hanai was on staff team during what's a really difficult time, I think, for all of us. You guys really kept this project together, kept us on track, and were flexible enough as well to give us space to do the work that we needed to do. And so I certainly hope that the work of Equity Scholars continues on in whatever form after our first this iteration, because I think this is really a time where we're seeing, as we're seeing from the other projects, the fruits of this kind of work. I'll just mention really briefly the context of our project, which is the Asian Canadian Asian Migration Studies program. We are a fairly new academic program in the Faculty of Arts. We're about 8 years old, and we were founded really on the kind of twin pillars of community engagement and anti-racism. We were actually founded as a tribute to 76 Japanese Canadian elders, now elders, but at that time were students in 1942 who were expelled from UBC unjustly at the beginning of the Japanese Canadian internment. And so we really carried that story into our courses across different Asian Canadian communities. And one of the larger challenges that we've had as an academic program is how do we integrate anti-racism and community engagement structurally into the building program capacity and in all our kind of normal, our regular operation. And so what we've learned again and again is that UBC, like probably many universities, don't necessarily prioritize these two issues in their structures, and that we're often having to do workarounds and trying to figure out ways to integrate community in ways that are respectful to community members, but also useful to our students. And so for us, these questions of capacity and structure would include curriculum, how we work with faculty. We draw faculty from across the Faculty of Arts. How do we negotiate with faculty for their teaching needs? How do we plan teaching curriculum, both in the classroom, but also in the broader curriculum planning side of things? How do we develop student community both in the classroom as well as outside the classroom? And that outside the classroom piece is absolutely crucial so that students connect with each other outside their particular courses, as well as connect community. And then finally, questions about community engagement and accountability, or how do we actually build in accountability with our community partners when we're working with such a variety of community organizations and elders and partners. So these are really broad questions that we kind of struggle with. But just for the purposes of our project, there we go. We wanted to enable ACAM to build an interdisciplinary undergraduate curriculum that embeds and integrates equity and inclusion, community engagement in all levels. And I really want to emphasize this in all levels in a holistic manner. Let me talk a little bit about some of the deliverables, and I'll give you a sense of things that we're thinking about. So we began, pre-COVID, we began with a consultation with all the ACAM faculty. We have about 15 faculty on our roster about curriculum design, strategic development, and also how to help them contribute more to the program. Because again, our faculty are drawn from different departments. One thing I learned that was really amazing, for example, was we were talking about how to deliver a first year capstone course. And one of my colleagues said, we really need to team teach it. And I said, well, why do you want to team teach it? And she said, the reason why is because faculty need extra mutual support for the emotional labor that is done in these kind of courses. And that really, really just brought home to me, these are insights from my colleagues. How do we actually make teaching questions of race and equity sustainable in the long term? Well, team teaching is one way. Team teaching is not always possible, but how do we then create the capacity and the structures to do that kind of thing? So the other thing that we've been working on is building student community through an initiative called ACAM Dialogue, which began as a series of student-led dialogues on kind of pressing issues around Asian Canadian communities on campus. So for example, sexual violence, mental health, race in the university. And it's really now grown substantially in the last 2 years into a leadership development program so that the students who work as the student leadership that works with us are trained in how to facilitate difficult conversations and how to plan conversations that bring different perspectives together to kind of foster community on the ground. And they've been sort of doing work now just even beyond ACAM. They've been working with the Vice President Students Office and other kind of groups on campus to share some of these experiences. Support for community engaged courses. I just want to mention two that we were really focused on for this project. One is a course on Asian Canadian histories for our time, which collaborates with the Powell Street Festival Society, which is a prominent Japanese Canadian community organization. And the other is a course on health in Asian Canadian communities, which focuses on mental health, health outcomes, and that is in collaboration with practitioners and is sort of drawing students from different disciplines to think about health, both at a very practical level, but also in a broad kind of sense of its relationship to race. So these two were the classes that really were our focus classes. How do we bring community speakers? How do we have community members mentor our students? How do we plan classes at the very beginning with community in mind, as opposed to just slotting community into courses that already exist? And I'll just finally mention, everything changed during COVID. As I think many folks know, during COVID, there was a huge escalation in anti-Asian racism across North America. Vancouver was declared the anti-Asian racism capital of North America by Bloomberg News, rather unfortunately. And overnight, things changed because in our classrooms, we were dealing with students who were traumatized by their own experiences, by the fear of being on buses, and by the news that was coming around them. And of course, faculty were doing extra work in their teaching. We were having a lot of demands of our time, sort of off campus. And I think that really changed what we thought ACAM should do. For one thing, the classes that I mentioned filled up right away. Students were looking for places to work out what it meant to do Asian Canadian studies during this time. And there's two things I was quickly mentioned that came out of this that, again, we did not expect at all, but really drew on the capacity that we're building through this project. And one was the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism that was held June last year. This was shepherded by the President's Office. And sort of in response to the urgency of racist attacks, we had about less than 4 months to essentially convene a national conversation online about anti-Asian racism. And that end up being 130 speakers, 2,000 people across Canada participated over 2 days across 10 sectors: education, healthcare, business, and across different sectors. And I wanted to say, like, that drew extensively on faculty support. But the part I really want to mention for this project is that one of the students that we work with through ACAM Dialogues chaired the National Student Advisory Council for this. And so she was one who was taking the lead in coordinating students from universities across Canada to think about how to organize in relationship to anti-Asian racism. And that's what building capacity does. It allows us to step in during a time of crisis and respond in very concrete ways to take the conversation further. And I'll just mention one of the things that was promised at the National Forum by the Faculty of Arts is a new Center for Asian Canadian Research Engagement that was approved a couple of months ago. And this is going to be a new academic unit on campus that will take up some of this kind of work, supporting ACAM's course delivery, but also really enhancing the community engagement side of things and enable to disseminate research on Asian Canadian studies further. And so we're working on kind of getting that started, again, drawing on these community networks for accountability. But again, all this would not be possible without these kind of capacity and structures that were built through this project. So I'm going to stop there. I've gone too long, but I'm going to pass things over to Susan Grossman, who's my colleague from the Center for Community Engaged Learning. Susan, are you there?
Thanks, Chris. You are a hard act to follow. So Chris spoke a lot about embedding systems into the ACAM program so that they could be sustained. So one of the roles that my office took on was to support embedding community engaged learning pedagogy into ACAM courses, the two courses specifically that Chris was talking about, and using that kind of pedagogy to highlight for students inequities and intersecting social problems and root causes in society so that they could identify some pathways to challenge those systems and look at community-led solutions. So building capacity through the curriculum itself as well, and giving students the tools to understand how they can make change in society. I will say, for those not familiar with community engaged learning, there's a couple key features to know. One is it's aspires to give students to achieve real social change. Another is it's a counter-normative pedagogy, so it interrogates whose knowledge counts and who is the teacher and who is the learner. I would also say it's also about relationships and focusing on the quality of relationship, moving from transactional to actually a really intentional relationship with community and with each other. And then finally, critical reflection. So looking at values and positionality, one's own values and positionalities relative to structural inequalities. So really building on an already strong foundation within ACAM and building in this these supports enable kind of the student work and the other work that happens to have some of this rounded out in the academic context as well. So our role really was to help Chris and the team build in systems and supports to enable community engaged learning to persist beyond from year to year. And really, there were already strong relationships with community from ACAM. So our role was actually quite easy. Often we're helping build those relationships. Those already existed. So that's all I really have to say. And I'll pass it back to Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Janice Stewart, and I'm the Associate Dean Faculty in the Faculty of Arts. Use the pronouns they and them. I'm white, non-binary person with short hair and a gray sweater. And I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Annette Henry, who I will pass this to in a few seconds. I just wanted to say we created this project, Learning from Strangers, to begin to deal with the challenges of teaching about race, racism in different kinds of classrooms. And we're hoping that this really speaks to specifically faculty and graduate students who are teaching, to help them, give them a few tools to begin to think very complexly, I guess, is that a word? That's not even a word. To think in a complex way about, the challenges that are arising in classrooms and what is deeply embedded in inclusive learning and what that might mean. And I'll turn to Dr. Henry to say a few words too, and then we'll progress through our slides.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you very much, Dennis. And we wanted to, I suppose I should introduce myself. Annette Henry, she, her. I'm on the unceded traditional ancestral territories of the Musqueam people here at UBC. So it's been a pleasure to work with Janice and try to eradicate racism in the world. Which is rather impossible, but we just try to make a dent in what we're doing in terms of helping faculty think about their teaching. We want to, from other data that other studies I've done, I just finished a Black graduate student study and another one with high school students. And really some of the issues are the same. The students don't see themselves in the curriculum. They feel misunderstood often by faculty and teachers. It's also means something when you don't see yourself reflected. And obviously we can't necessarily do that, but what we can do is think of ways that we can help empower students and help give students voices. And I mean, some of the things that have been said earlier today really also emphasize this. So we want to, as we made some videos of people talking about their experiences and how we can learn from these experiences. I think we want to show you a video at this point. Thanks, Janice. So you're showing the slides there. Yeah.
How do we collaborate on producing a classroom environment where learning and being together feels good? Where we're excited to come, where we feel safe but challenged, where we feel heard, where we feel we can be open and vulnerable without being exposed or harmed, and where we are able to allow ourselves to be open to being surprised. It's a fantasy to imagine that what's happening in the classroom in both form and content is not related to what's happening in the world. This idea that the classroom can be this kind of separated space that is not connected to the world that we live in. It's not only a fantasy, but it's really dangerous. And I think we do our students an immense disservice, if not a great harm, by perpetuating ideas that one, social justice is not inherently rigorous and intellectual and has always been. To imagine that it's possible to artificially separate any knowledge project from questions of justice or injustice is also a fantasy, right? Which is to say, any knowledge project, which is presumably what we're involved in the university, is always already a project about power. So you can either teach students, equip students to be critical about that, or you can actually obscure those power relations for them, right? So they start believing in things like objectivity or neutrality, which don't exist.
I see social justice teaching as a critical tool, something that performs action and that also is enabling and agency producing. For example, I was having a conversation with my students about this idea of creativity. And one of them said to me, we can be creative in our writing practices. And I mean, in this case, the student was talking about their essay, but I think that extends to their relationship with particular power structures, with particular ways that others treat them, or they see others being treated, right? That they have the agency to create, to rework, to see things as moldable and changeable, right? Whether it be the Canadian literature canon, whether it's Canadian history, whether it's their own relationship to power and authority, whether it's certain systemic structures that they've taken for granted in relation to other groups of individuals that they may not necessarily identify with. For me, that's what social justice is within the framework of pedagogy.
Defining social justice teaching has become an interesting task for us to do at this point because of the way in which the term has been used and co-opted in some sense in reference to how different groups of people, whether it be from corporations to institutions, are really taking up this need for social justice within our society. So we've recognized that there's groups of people, marginalized people within our society, that are facing injustices on a day-to-day basis. And social justice becomes that vehicle that pushes us towards addressing some of those wrongs. Now, because it's being used across the board by institutions and corporations, it gets a little bit muffled in terms of what it means. And so when I think about social justice teaching, I'm not necessarily thinking about a subject that is on its own. I'm thinking about the way that we as people living in a world, in a society, and socially gathering, how do we then engage and interact with each other compassionately? How do we then emphasize inclusion? How do we make sure that people's voices are heard and validated? How do we ensure that they have the basic human rights that all of us deserve? And so it becomes less about social justice as a subject and more so about a lifestyle that really includes, that is the only way we're gonna actually get to a point where all people are seen as human and are treated in humane ways based on a set of standard rights and responsibilities that we all have for ourselves and to each other.
To me, social justice teaching it is education for critical consciousness. It has to do with creating conditions where people can have a rich experience of self, where they bring their full self to the classroom, and their kind of perspectives are validated and guide whatever kind of approach to education that they have. So in other words, I mean that there is a kind of political import or purpose to a social justice education, where the purpose has to do with more than getting the credits or proving that you have satisfied certain criteria or proving that you've jumped through the right hoops. It does relate to how people's individual experiences allow them to approach the classroom space and to have their mind maybe changed. And that's not to say that they're getting sort of filled up with all the information and knowledge. People arrive with a full and rich sense of self and knowledge. And I think, when social justice education works, when that can be nurtured within the class. And I think that's the kind of through line that cuts across. And then the individual disciplines or topics can all be sort of oriented around that. Because I think critical consciousness doesn't mean developing a certain politics. It doesn't mean aligning yourself with one movement or another, although it can mean those things. But it's to really have as the the objective of education be to think critically and creatively and to question. That is something that I think is aligned with a social justice education and doesn't easily map on to the goal of an education being the degree itself.
So we were a little bit impacted by COVID. We didn't get quite as many interviews, but we've made several of these videos and we're working currently on a website that'll be accessible to everyone. And I know that time now is of the essence, so I'll just give the final word to Dr. Henry, if you have anything that you would like to say at the end here.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to say that this is such a critical time. We talk about this post George Floyd moment, and universities across the board, and as Janice talked about, institutions that are across the board, I think it was a previous speaker, working for social justice, but I think we have to, I think it's a beautiful time for us to really think about what that means for each of us in our own work, how we look at our curriculum, how we restructure our teaching, how we, and not have fear to really make our curriculum as relevant as possible. And as we just heard about anti-Asian racism as well. And so I think this is really such an important time for us to really think very deeply about what we're doing in our classrooms and who we serve and the effect that our teaching has on students. I think I'm repeating myself a bit, but I just think this is just such a lovely moment to think about it, and hopefully that it will continue and that UBC will really be a place where every student feels comfortable and faculty members feel supported in trying to be the best pedagogue that they can be.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the scholars for your presentations today. And hi, everyone. My name is Greg Lockwood. I'm joining today from unceded Stolid Coast Salish territories, lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in downtown Vancouver. I'm in a shared space today. I use the pronouns he and him, and I'm a white man with short hair, a dark blue shirt, a plant in the background. And I'm just going to speak very briefly to a few of the learnings from the evaluation that happened at the midterm, or what was meant to be the midterm mark of the program after 1 year, and then hold space for questions for the scholars. I was lucky enough to be involved with supporting the evaluation of this work. And I have to say, when I had the chance to read through the presentations after being removed from the project for some time, I was really struck by the diversity, the comprehensiveness of the work, and really the ability to carry on these projects with such care and adaptability through a pandemic and snow days. It was such a joy to read through and to be here today to listen to all the work that's been done. So at the 1 year mark, we conducted an evaluation which was with great credit to all of the scholars. A lot of the labor in the evaluation was completed by the scholars themselves to arrive at some of these key findings. And really, we did this evaluation with the goal of streamlining a process for the program participants to assess the impact of their respective projects, and also to facilitate learning from the overall program. And at this point, we uncovered findings in a couple of key areas with respect to the faculty learning community, which facilitated it, and it was meant to facilitate effective collaboration amongst the project teams. We learned that with the design of it being as a vehicle to engage project teams in a community of practice, it was a space for providing those that might not traditionally have access to such network to support each other. So there was 3 half days of get-togethers with other pop-in opportunities to meet amongst the 6 teams, and that it provided a springboard for learning about commonalities across disciplines by stepping out of one's disciplinary bubble, which can be quite isolating, as we heard from them. Structural scheduling challenges were unavoidable. 6 project teams and 24 team members made it somewhat challenging, but ultimately, all the teams showed great resilience in being able to navigate an incredible change in the teaching environment in March of 2020. And then the second key area around resourcing and support that we heard from the scholars, backbone support for the program was key, and that fortunately staff from the Equity and Inclusion Office were able to provide that in some ways by making themselves available and reaching out to the teams individually to provide needed support. But ultimately, although some needs such as curriculum development expertise were met through the connections with the EIO, there were other external supports that the teams needed to go outside to seek, such as, for example, statistical expertise. We also heard that the provision of easy access to funds for scholars that required small amounts of funding to meet their project needs was key. And we heard that from each of the teams that their projects would not have moved forward without the funding provided by this program. So that was nice to hear. And then in addition to project funding, the program brought together, of course, an incredible cross-disciplinary network of scholars that would not have otherwise formed. And then just to kind of summarize a narrative from one of the project team members, this notion of providing support and a safe space to meet with like-minded faculty in order to plan, deliver, and evaluate the project was key. So I'm just doing a time check here. I know we only have a few minutes. And so I've received a couple of specific questions for a couple of the teams. And I'm sorry to ask this because there's so much that we could talk about, I think, after hearing from all of you. But if you could limit your responses to about 60 seconds, I know that's not nearly enough time. I have a couple of questions for some specific teams, and then I have a general question for the rest of the teams. So we'll start with the presentation on enhancing equity across active learning introductory science courses with Karen and Jacqueline. And the question is, could you share examples, perhaps one example of changes in your teaching practice that was informed by this project?
You want to go, Karen?
Go ahead, Jackie.
Well, I think I have personal, I guess, changes, but the goal of our project is we're still at the stage where we're trying to figure out what's going on, which I know is, a kind of a cop-out in terms of researcher, like we don't know enough to really make change. But I think personally, things like adopting general inclusive teaching practices. So in my syllabus, I, talk about myself and my own journey, which might seem self-serving, but it's really to open the door for students to bring themselves to the classroom. So it's kind of modeling that. When I was teaching online, I did things like persistent groups. So when students were working together, I kind of kept those same groups for a while so that students who might feel less comfortable changing groups all the time could develop some relationships and some security. There's no perfect way to do that. But I think those are some small things. And I'll say kind of more generally, one finding we're just kind of detecting now is since we're measuring both disciplinary belonging, to what extent somebody feels like they belong to chemistry or biology or physics, versus social belonging, those social supports and connections in a classroom, we are seeing differences when we look at the data. So knowing both of those, I think, will help guide us. Okay, if students are suggesting that they have a lower sense of social belonging, we can do some interventions about that. If it's disciplinary belonging, those would be different interventions. So I'm excited about what's coming next. That was long. Sorry. Karen, do you want to say anything else?
Just really quickly, Greg, if I can. And I do apologize, my audio earlier just had audio problems. But anyway, so I just wanted to add that one of the questions, because I was sort of leading the learning activities questionnaire, and we asked what are the barriers to working in groups and in class activities. And it was really eye-opening. And just to let you know that predominantly students reported psychological barriers to learning in groups and in the classroom. And that varied from, interactions with other students, feeling the fear of, not knowing enough, etc. And I think that really opened my eyes, because I think that we can structure a classroom like, do we give them random groups? Do we set up groups? But if students have these internal psychological barriers, we need to think more deeply about how to overcome that, so students could be focused on learning and not focused on their own psychology, which prevents them from moving forward in that learning. So if there's anything I have to add about that, maybe that's helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen and Jacqueline. The next question is for Mario and Leanne's team on the community as a teacher. Could you say a word about the experience of involving community partners in academic writing?
I think it was a great experience. As an academic writer, we tend to focus on how we've been taught to write, but having community members who don't have that framework that always guides them really allowed us to have some creativity in how we actually developed the manuscript. And I believe, Mario, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a few edits that we needed and a few revisions that were needed. And I think it really brought a sense of bringing the project together, because the community partner was involved from the development to the implementation to the evaluation and then the dissemination. And I think it gave them a sense of inclusion in academia, and being a part of educating that future healthcare profession. It was good. I appreciated it.
Thank you, Leanne. And with our last few minutes here, I'm going to open it up to the entire 6 teams with a question which was hard to come up with because of the diversity of the projects. But I'm going to ask you all about, and I'm just entering it into the chat here, with regards to the sustainability and scaling of your projects. What are you most excited about? So in our last couple of minutes here, for any of the remaining teams that feels compelled to chime in on this one, please go ahead.
Hi, folks. So for us, the dentistry folks here, is the possibility of now having these 3 sessions. And one, I was just listening to the last presentation. It is about social justice and social responsibility in providing oral and dental care. So quite timely there. I'm very happy because now those 3 sessions are part of the existing curricula. So they will not go away. So I like that moving forward, that is part of our curriculum from now on. Yeah.
I can add that for our project was able to provide an easy solution for all health programs. So it creates a sustainable process going forward. We share it with other programs across Canada, by the way, other universities, which the accessibility advisors in other universities loved it and want to borrow it also. So obviously, things change in life and programs are different. So you need to adapt the processes that we proposed for different programs, but it's adaptable and it's usable and it's definitely sustainable. So that's really exciting for the buy-in from other programs.
Thank you, Tal and Mario. We're going to wrap things up there. And I'm going to just say a note of gratitude and thanks to all the scholars once again, and turn it over to my colleague, Miriam Nababi, for the closing remarks.
Thanks, Greg. Just wanted to wrap up and say thank you to all the scholars for all the work and effort over the past 3 years on these projects. It's been such a pleasure to get a better sense of where they've gone and how they've evolved. And with each one, I feel there's so much reach and potential and scalability and transferability across academic disciplines. And as we navigate these post-pandemic times and a return to campus for students, I think we're going to be grappling with a whole new set of equity issues around and inclusive issues as well. So I'm really looking forward to finding opportunities to elevate all of your good work as we move forward. So once again, deep thanks, and we look forward to following your work. And thanks everyone for joining us today as well.